folks. We are going to be recording today's webinar for our members. If there's some people that had to miss this, they can certainly come in and be able to incorporate this into your thought leadership back at your own workplaces. But welcome to today's continuing series in our thought leadership and knowledge capital series, Wellbeing and your Indigenous Workplace Inclusion Strategy. My name is Kelly Lendsay. I'm President and CEO, and Craig Hall, Chief Operating Officer. We're going to be taking you through this webinar today. This one has been a lot of fun to do, and I'm speaking to you as I get ready for this. I'm speaking to you not from Treaty 6 in the Métis homeland of Saskatchewan, but in Vernon, BC, Okanagan Indian lands and the Tsleil-Waututh people. So great here, and Craig is in Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia. We've got people from across Canada, and we've really hit a nerve with this webinar. And I think I encourage you, make some notes. You can use the chat function. You know the routine, folks. Use the chat function below if you want to pose some questions, and we can get to the Q&A at the end of our presentation. So again, for those, we do have some guests that have signed on to this one. A little bit about Indigenous Works. We came out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People as one of the 430 recommendations that was issued in 1996. Our concept was developed in 97, and we were formally launched in 98. I was hired as the first president and CEO. A year later, brought Craig along. We've been the two key principals. And again, our focus has been on workplace inclusion strategies. And I think we've brought a lot of systems thinking, the inclusion continuum, diagnostics. Now, last year we launched the first employer certification program in Canada. And so we're sort of got our one foot in the corporate world, one in the Indigenous world, and one in the academic world, really looking at how do we advance workplace inclusion systems, performance, and excellence. So we got our feet in your shoes as well. How do we help you mobilize your strategies and develop and take them to new levels? We have this expanding research agenda. We just launched a very, very interesting and exciting partnership with the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. So we're expanding our work more broadly with our D&I partner at ICD.D. And we're continuing to do work with the Canadian Human Rights Commission and others. So that's a bit about us. I'm going to ask Craig Hall just to talk about where we're going to be going. Craig will do the sort of the front end of today's presentation. And Craig, over to you to describe where we're going to take people on this webinar.
Thanks, Kelly. So yes, I'm the front end, and Kelly, that makes you the back end. So yeah, so we've got a good little webinar there for you today. It's divided into 4 parts. So we'll start off just talking a little bit about well-being in the workplace. And then we'll introduce you to a literature that we find very interesting. It's looking at different conceptions of happiness and well-being. And we'll talk a little bit about how some of the governments now are starting to introduce well-being budgets. Fascinating. Then we'll take you through a little bit more about the how Indigenous well-being can be embedded into your workplace inclusion strategy. And then we have some tips and takeaways for you at the end of this webinar. And we'll have about 20 minutes at the end or so for some questions and discussion from the group. So next slide.
Sorry.
There you go. So first little bits about well-being in the workplace, and we'll just talk to you about a few features. So in one of the next slide there, one of the reports that we were leafing through talked about a survey from Indeed.com, and it's, I think, a fairly standard list of things that employers are looking for in terms of a well-being workplace. So it's things like, have a clear sense of purpose, they feel appreciated, they feel there's a sense of belonging in the workplace and the company or the organization. They have time, location, and flexibility they need to do the work. They're working in an inclusive and respectful workplace environment. They're able to learn at work, so there's a sense of professional development. They have a manager who helps them succeed. That's really, really important. They're paid fairly. Pay is not at the top of the list, as you know. They feel supported. That's so important. And there's trust among their colleagues. So this is sort of a typical list that you would find on in many, many HR theorists about what constitutes well-being in the workplace. So on the next slide, it's sort of getting at the business case, right? Which is, if there's well-being in the workplace, you've got employees who like their work, they like the people at work and feel good about the workplace and what they do, and they're engaged and they're productive, and there's strong senses of collaboration and cooperation, and people put in extra effort and commitment to a quality product and quality mission. And all of these things in their own right are studied very intensely by different academics and theorists across the country, across the world, because they recognize the link between healthy, well-being workplace and the outputs and outcomes of organizations. So now I'll just give you a little bit of sense of what's going on in this very vast literature. And you've got, as I mentioned before, countries. You've got a bunch of academics studying happiness and well-being, and then we'll get a little later on to what some of the Indigenous groups are doing on the well-being front. But it's quite interesting. But if you go back in the literature on the next slide, there was a lot of interest when Bhutan kind of surfaced in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And they talked about this gross national happiness index. And if you look at the surveys that Bhutan developed, ultimately when they introduced this program in 2008, they're quite extensive, and you can easily find them on the internet. And you see that they go on for a number of pages, and they probe all sorts of aspects of well-being. It's organized according to these 4 pillars, which you see here. And it's a kind of an early version that helped propel a lot of different research in this area. So initially, the National Happiness Index was seen as sort of 2 things. One, a kind of reactance to the GDP models, which provide conceptions that are sort of more focused on economic outputs. And there was a dissatisfaction around the fact that GDP wasn't a great measure, right? It didn't sort of address people's core needs. And didn't address things like sustainability and sort of relationships and trust and sustainability factors in other areas as well. So there was, I think, a lot of thought put into this. Again, it was conceived in the 70s. It wasn't until about 2008 that it really started to develop. And at that time, if you go to the next slide, there
Greg,
was.
I'll just say that the king of Bhutan at the time,
Yep.
he is famously quoted as saying, "What's more important than our gross national product is the gross national happiness of my people." And he was 17 years old at the time.
Wow, that's amazing. Young and wise all at once. So it was at that time, then in 2012, the United Nations started to kind of propagate this new paradigm. And they started producing, in cooperation with an organization, these World Happiness Reports that continue to come out annually. And initially it was an effort to spread the Bhutan philosophy, but of course, they've verged out into other areas as well. And it's a pretty, these have been great reports to have over the years. And I think the first one, Kelly, if just was one of the Halliwell brothers who helped to author it. And I sort of recall that we invited him to speak at one of our events one year.
Indeed, we did.
And it was very interesting. And at that time, this research was very, very new and continues to gain ground, of course. So on the next slide, again, we've got quite a few new takes on well-being, and you've got about 21 countries across the world that have adopted well-being economic models. So you've got Iceland and New Zealand as sort of the front runners. Canada as well has started to do some work in this area. We haven't sort of quite adopted it in quite the same way as, say, New Zealand has, but we're doing some work in that effort. And of course, there's a lot of conversations on the next slide between different countries that have formed sort of more coalitions or knowledge sharing efforts to help understand, how these things can be measured, how well-being can be developed with different metrics, and how that's done in different countries. You see a lot of the Nordic countries taking a strong interest in this, but New Zealand was certainly one of the first to adopt a full well-being budget back in 2019 or so. So this Wellbeing Economy Alliance has done a lot of good work. They meet on a regular basis, and there's sort of 5 human needs for a good life that they're looking at. It's again the same themes. It's a sense of connection, belonging, doing common good together, dignity, fairness, which is very important in terms of social justice, and active engagement from people, and then relationship to natural world. So these are some of the key things that this particular group has sort of conceptualized. And if you chase down, we'll send you this PowerPoint later. You can chase down, if you're not familiar with some of these, look at some of the reports and things, and you'll start to see some very common themes right across the table here. So as I mentioned, New Zealand introduced their well-being budget in 2019, and they've really forged ahead. New Zealand has relied a lot on the work that OECD has done in this area. So they've got a very sophisticated set of metrics, and they're starting to now to look at sort of a second generation of metrics, future metrics. And we'll get to that in a second. But they publish, you can find on the internet easily, they call it dashboard metrics. And it includes different types of ways that they measure. And the whole government has basically charged each department within government to come up with these metrics and deliver on them. So there's been, very natural sort of criticism back and forth in New Zealand about, is this good for the country? Is it good for the economy? So there's still a tremendous amount of debate on this, but New Zealand is forging ahead. I mentioned the OECD, and they continue to publish each year this Better Life Index. So they've done a lot of work. And you can read here some of the things that they do, a kind of country by country breakdown of what's happening in terms of Better Life Index. And so talking about New Zealand, New Zealanders give it a 7.3 grade on average, which is higher than the OECD average of 6.5. Canada gives themselves 7.4 in comparison to the 6.5. And I chose at random a country that I think is really interesting, Estonia, who gave themselves 5.7 on average out of the 6.5. So if you go to this website, and I've got it quoted there at the bottom, you can see all the different countries and the grading that they get when they fill out these different surveys and use the same sort of metrics. So now I'll turn back to Kelly. So that gives you a sort of real brief overview of what's happening in where we fit in terms of this well-being subject matter. It's very interesting. Go ahead, Kelly.
Great. So folks, in the second part, we want to take this subject matter of well-being, and we've launched another initiative at Indigenous Works called Luminary. And Luminary is about advancing Indigenous innovation for economic transformation, employment, and well-being. We have over 150 partners. We've got 80 universities and colleges, various over 50 Indigenous businesses and economic development corporations, and a number of NGOs and others like Fulbright Canada and Stats Canada's partners. And so we're really looking at some of the research that we're looking at, in addition to building research and collaborations that could drive, new commercial products, processes, and jobs. We're looking at this whole outcome around well-being. What do we mean by well-being? And so Craig's giving you this overview of what's happening in Canada and around the world around this global well-being movement. And I want to layer over top of that Indigenous constructs, Indigenous thinking towards this. Subhash, I see Alexandra's in the waiting room. Can you let her in, please? So research on well-being by organizations. There is not a lot of research. There's a recent one last year done by the Assembly of First Nations out of British Columbia, and they started to look at the concepts of well-being. And if you look back historically, this is Turtle Island, first observed by space astronauts. The whole concept, you hear elders talk about Turtle Island and incorporate that into their prayers, and often in meetings we'll talk about Turtle Island, which is North America, and there are different creation stories around Turtle Island. One of the ones, of course, with First Nations people is the medicine wheel, and there are about 130 medicine wheels across Turtle Island. There's one in good old Saskatoon, right at Wanaskewin. And really, it's this idea of how do you achieve social, emotional, intellectual, and physical well-being. And it's this idea, we use this word holistic, it is this holistic approach to life and achieving well-being in your community, your family, with yourself, in your workplace. So again, we know of some of the very common ones in Canada. Many of you are familiar with the medicine wheel, but I want to introduce you to perhaps some other constructs that may be new to you or haven't heard. When we think about also Métis and Inuit concepts of well-being, there are these constructs that are very similar in terms of for the Métis, the spiritual, the physical, emotional, and mental dimensions with their environments. The Inuit have adopted what they call the IQ principles. And these IQ principles are grounded in 4 big laws: working in common good, respecting all things, maintaining harmony and balance, and continually planning and preparing for the future. These IQ principles, and there are 8 of them, they are so important to the Inuit that they have mandated that the government, industry, and the education system need to incorporate the IQ principles in everything they do throughout Nunavut. So if you're going to do work with the Inuit, your organization or company is going to be working, you need to be knowledgeable about this particular Inuit construct. So I mentioned there are 8 IQ principles. My Inuktitut isn't up to pronouncing these, but you can see it gives you an idea, and we've got a link here for you. It's about number 1, respecting others, relationships, and caring for people. Fostering good spirits by being open, welcoming, and inclusive. Serving and providing, family and community. Decision-making through consensus and discussion. Development of skills through observation, mental practice, and effort. So then speaking to acquisition of skills and learning. Working together for a common cause, being innovative and resourceful, and respect and care for the land, animals, and the environment. Think about these 8 IQ principles as I now go through some other constructs, and you'll start to see some very interesting connections, similarities between Indigenous thought and people around the world. So right here at home in Canada, in the north, I remember going up one time to Yellowknife, went into the meeting, and they had this beautiful poster with the Dene 7 laws. And the Dene have these values and principles and 7 laws. And these values and principles have this humanistic quality. Many of them have been reflected in cultures throughout the world and at different times in history. And I think this is what's really, I've always remembered the Dene as I think about Indigenous thinking and worldviews globally. The Dene have believed that these values and principles are as fundamental as life itself, and they give an expression to the purpose and fulfillment of human life. And they also serve as a very practical function of ensuring the survival of the people. So this will be well ingrained through Dene there, and there's the Dene Cho, the Métis Dene communities through the territories. Looking to Ontario, you often hear about the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people: honesty, humility, truth, wisdom, love, respect, bravery. So again, you're starting to see that there are these worldviews that incorporate the connections to land, to people, to community. And now I want to use 2 international examples. In Australia, some of you may be familiar with dream time. And if you watch movies, sometimes they'll refer to dream time and going on your walkabout, which is at, around puberty, where you go and it's this discovery, and you go on your dream walk and your dream time. So it is a philosophy known more broadly as dreaming. And it is about this interrelation of all people and things. And in the dreaming, an individual's ancestry exists on culminating in the idea that all your worldly knowledge has been accumulated and shared through the ancestors. You hear them acknowledge their ancestors in their prayers and in their ceremonies. So again, this whole concept of dream time is really one of what they call world creation time. And it's laid down the pattern for life for Aborigine people. I remember when I was in Australia, folks, there was an elder, and she was participating in some of the sessions that Craig and I were doing down under. And she said to me, "When you stop dreaming, you are lost. When you stop dreaming, you are lost." So again, this is how fundamental it is to their existence. You must go through and be able to embrace dreaming. The Maori. So Craig mentioned New Zealand. Now, what's really cool about New Zealand is they are really the first country to adopt these new well-being measures beyond GDP. And what's incorporated within the New Zealand matrix is a lot of Maori thinking and concepts. So the Métis have these 4 cornerstones: family health, physical health, mental health, spiritual health. Are you starting to see some relationship to the medicine wheel? Dene thinking, again, other Indigenous groups. And again, the octopus in terms of the tentacles. So the animal spirits that they take their lessons from. So again, the well-being is a foundation, Maori well-being in and of itself is a foundation of Maori development and constitutes what we call a good life. I don't have a slide about the good life, but in Canada, amongst the Mohawks, mainly the Mohawks, they have this whole concept around the good life and the good mind. Another excellent one that we should bring into this presentation. So that gives you, I think, an overview of incorporating these Indigenous worldviews and getting an understanding of what's happened globally as Craig took us through and what's happened in Canada. And indeed, how do we bring in some Indigenous constructs and how do we now incorporate this in terms of your work in the workplace? And what are some things that you could take into consideration? So some of the things that that we could be looking at is in terms of this sort of systems thinking with your workplace is policies. Do we have respectful policies? Or does some of that respectful policy language look at the language that's being used by the local Métis, Inuit, and First Nations groups? Being knowledgeable about some of these well-being constructs and values and principles could perhaps be integrated or aligned with some of your policies, your language around respectful workplaces. Engagement surveys. The Gallup poll, going back 20 years ago, the #1 driver was, do I feel included? That was out of 10 engagement drivers, that was #1. And Craig showed you the list, the more current list of engagement drivers, and it's still right up there in the top 3. And what's interesting about engagement surveys is these engagement drivers are critical to getting the most out of your employees. And it's important for retention and advancement and productivity. And ultimately about fulfillment in the workplace. So again, looking at some of the value systems and principles of Indigenous groups can be a very interesting way, we think, to start to rethink how we might even do engagement surveys. How can we bring some Indigenous thinking into creating some Indigenous constructs around engagement surveys? So we're interested in this from a research perspective. If any of you are, contact us and we'll bring you in as we start to think about how we could formulate this as a research project. Accommodation for cultural practices, respecting the practices that they have, and Indigenous people getting engaged in recruitment efforts. So what are Indigenous people looking for in an inclusive workplace? Equitable training, learning opportunities, a respectful workplace, and this congruency of values. And I think it's this congruency where there's been conflict, there have been differences, there's been omissions. So again, stewards of the land, for example, commitments to truth and reconciliation. This is the congruence of values that people will be looking for in your workplaces. And at a cultural level, well-being. Indigenous people, we hear through and when we do our diagnostic evaluations and surveys, and we benchmark them on the inclusion continuum, we continually hear this idea that Indigenous employees want this affirmation of their identity. And they're not looking for anything special or extra compared to other people in your workplace. They're looking for this affirmation of identity, perspectives, and ideas. They're looking for workplaces to be more knowledgeable about the history of Indigenous peoples. And they're looking for policies, both formal and informal, that can reinforce, I think, some of the well-being principles that we shared with you today. So, Craig, over to you. Talk a bit more about cultural level in terms of well-being. It is a growing narrative. We're seeing more academics and community members starting to examine this. And we are trying to, I think, articulate what do we mean by identity in the workplace. And so, Craig, over to you for the next slide about how we might start to look at layering over things. And this is just one example, Craig, of bringing the medicine wheel thinking and layering it over the inclusion continuum.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So I mean, the inclusion continuum is our own model, which proposes a sort of 7-stage development to inclusive workplaces, and really it provides a way for us to understand the kind of level of sophistication, if I could say it that way, that companies and organizations have adopted in their efforts to do a better job in employing and attracting Indigenous people and providing a workplace that is good for them and helps them thrive. So we've spent a number of years on this particular model. We've developed it as we have worked with companies across Canada and the States and other parts. And we've developed a series of metrics that follow the evolution of organization strategies, workplace and HR strategies in the Indigenous area. It's really helped us understand how to help companies. And we see the potential of layering over that some of the teachings from the medicine wheel and improving on our model. So just a quick summary, and then we'll have some questions. I'll call it learning bites and takeaways. The next slide, we've got in essence, a very deep literature that's developed on happiness and well-being. Next slide there, Kelly.
Just hold on, stuck there.
There you go. A very deep literature on happiness and well-being that's developed over the past few decades. We just sort of gave a real quick thumbnail sketch. And there's certainly a sense that the Indigenous philosophies and the things that are being explored through more modern conceptions of well-being and happiness and that kind of thing, there's a high level of compatibility. And I think that the ultimate pitch that we're seeing here is that, there's so much to be learned from Indigenous people in terms of informing on those models. And that's where I think there's some great research yet to be done. And, we're beginning to see a lot of the adoption of these frameworks with governments now in many countries. And that's really starting to tip the scales in terms of the way well-being is sort of thought of and happiness is thought of and so on. And I think it's really going to open up a very interesting dialogue in the coming years with citizens and with Indigenous groups and so on as to the place of well-being and how we're using it to really understand the progress of society and our economies and our place in the world. And certainly in the next slide, we recognize that we've gone through this very unusual period with COVID, and there's a much greater emphasis, and we'll see this more and more in the workplace, about well-being in the workplace. And companies are definitely under more scrutiny than they have been in the past to sort of explain, what they're doing, the programs and all these things, that how they're looking out for their employees. And this whole theme is very compatible with this idea of well-being. And we're seeing that in such things as the new lens that's being put on ESG reporting. And we've been following that as well very carefully. We'll do a future webinar on this for sure, because it's a fascinating area in terms of how that's being reported and tracked by companies in the corporate world. So next slide, again, well-being measures in the workplace are, again, going to become very important in the future. And I think people who are applying for jobs and looking for careers are going to be more and more selective about where they apply, and based on their own assessment of quality of the workplace experience that they're likely to enjoy. Increasingly, as we talk to Indigenous people who are looking to join the corporate world, they're interviewing the companies as much as the companies are interviewing them. They want to know what the workplace is like. They want to know how the company is helping the communities, what those relationships are like, and so on. And it's a very, very different sort of experience around the recruitment effort than it was in the past. I think it's a really very, very healthy approach now these days. So on the next slide, again, there's particular features and attributes that Indigenous people are looking for in the workplaces. We interview hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous employees each year, and we get a really good understanding of what they're looking for. And I think this idea of Indigenous concepts of well-being and how they can inform on workplace design is a really, really great idea, and something that we'd certainly enjoy talking with academic companies and other organizations that are interested in this particular research, because we'd love to take this on in a much bigger way. Last point, last slide. So the things that you can do, educate your organization about Indigenous perspectives and frameworks about well-being. Identify potential partners. There's lots of different Indigenous groups that are doing research on well-being, particularly in the health area from that angle. And partner with them where you can, learn from them. And then your organization ultimately will be more attractive to Indigenous people, so as an employer of choice. And you'll be able to incorporate Indigenous ideas of well-being into your workplace design. So that's ultimately where we want to head. Kelly, did you have any concluding remarks as well on this? We've covered quite a lot of ground on this.
I think the comment, folks, is this is new. So there is, at this stage, we're sharing a lot of knowledge around this area, and we want to actually advance more research around this area. We, I mean, there are Indigenous people on this webinar, and you may know about the medicine wheel, but you didn't know about the Inuit IQ principles or the Dene. So again, it's not just Indigenous, I think all of us need to look at and improving our knowledge capital to see how we could now look at helping move these ideas of a well-being index or templates to help companies embrace well-being measures. That's sort of, Craig, where we've talked about where Luminary's research agenda can play a role with our Indigenous communities, with academic community, and we're getting strong interest in this area. So I think stay tuned, folks. I think this is going to be an emerging and growing area that could help not just Indigenous Canadians, but all Canadians as we think about well-being in Canada. And finally, COVID has taught us. COVID has taught us it's about mental well-being, physical well-being. Workplaces have changed. Women 19 to 34 with a child have been the hardest hit. I just saw on the news, 66% of nurses are burned out in Canada. These are real realities in terms of people's well-being, mental, physical, emotional, and intellectual well-being. So again, I think we can bring some Indigenous thought to this. And I think COVID has helped shine the light on the importance of looking at well-being for everybody. So as we were doing this, I scanned, I'm going to go to the chat because there's some very, very good comments. I'm going to hit some of these, and some of them are comments and some of them are questions here. Jay, you made a great comment, Jay from Shaw, that look, it's engagement drivers are good if people use them. So maybe some of this Indigenous thinking is actually going to stimulate even more interest in this idea of well-being linked to engagement drivers. I saw a comment here from, yeah, here it is. Engagement surveys are great if we're willing to act on them. Sandra Richardson, this is news to us. Would love to circle back. She says, our offices are located on Lekwungen speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We did a happiness index about 10 years ago based on the Bhutan model. That's amazing. I would love to see it and love to connect you into the work we're doing. It was incorporated into our annual vital signs report. So Sandra, good for you. Here you were doing this 10 years ago. And now here we are 10 years later. I think it's becoming even more relevant. So it's kind of cool that you have a baseline that can be included and learned from as we go forward. So those are just some of the comments. Sorry if I missed any, but any other comments or questions from the audience? There's a question here, would be good to see the demographics of the respondents. So I'm not quite sure.
I think that might have come up in relation to the OECD stuff. So my understanding of the index that OECD did was that they were interested in perfecting a tool that could be used by different nations and even communities. And so I think that's one trajectory of their research that they do actually, talk and ask people to fill out surveys.
Yeah.
The other part is this sort of more comparative type thing where they've gathered data from all these different countries and provided an overview of their sort of comparative status. So I think there's sort of two branches of the research.
Yeah. And I got a clarification. It was about which Canadians were asked. So we're back to good old basics, like who's the sample size, were Indigenous people included. So I love it. And I think those are good things. Shannon Henderson has her hand up. Shannon, over to you.
Hi, Kelly and Craig. It's nice to
Hi.
see you both.
Thank you.
I just have more of a statement than actually a question. So it's nice to see some of my folks on the line today, Madison and Sean, that are joining from Van City. So I'm Squamish Nation and I work for Van City Credit Union. One thing that I really wanted to say is, like, when you hire an Indigenous person, you're not just helping that person, you're helping the family, but you're actually helping the community. So embrace and, really empower them as well. Let's bring it together. And they are interviewing you. We're interviewing them, but, really stand behind what your purpose is and make sure it's genuine, come from the heart. Just don't try to do a tick box. Really look at your organization of where you're wanting to place folks. And we have an Indigenous employee resource group. Use the voices that are with you and really look within. So, Osium Hoichka, thank you.
Shannon, thank you so much. We did some work with Van City on their engagement and inclusion strategies years ago. And one of the highest, strongest sort of workplace cultures that we've seen, very engaged people. And to your point, you're putting it into practice. You have a fair living wage. You invested, 1.5 million through Truth and Reconciliation into walks and parades and these types of practices. So you've sort of put the practices and strategies into meaningful policies, programs, and tools. And your comments are spot on. I see Curtis, you got your hand up. Curtis Bunce, over to you, mate.
Thank you. First of all, a really terrific seminar here. Thank you for putting it on and all the work that went into it. So it's been excellent. One thing that one word that I picked up on that was used by either Kelly, you, or Craig, that I think resonates with me and may really have a lot of potential in terms of implementation is this concept of layering and layering sort of different worldview perspectives and sort of the different Indigenous worldview perspectives. Can you maybe just talk a little bit more when you talk about layering? What is it? What's the effect? How would we do it? What do you see in the future if layering was used more to incorporate these well-being concepts?
Sure. I'll start and then Craig, you can chime in. I would approach it two ways. I think layering involves Albert Marshall's thinking around two-eyed seeing. So Albert Marshall, Mi'kmaq elder, think of this, maybe some of you saw this in previous webinars with us. Two-eyed seeing is this big eyeball. It's how do you respect and value both traditional ways of knowing and doing and Western ways of knowing and doing? Not that one is better than the other, but you embrace both for the benefit of all. So I would look at this, Curtis, through that lens of two-eyed seeing. How do we look at the benefits of Indigenous approaches to well-being, as well as OECD, Bhutar, and others, and benefit that from that knowledge in our future thinking and work? So that's one aspect of layering. The second aspect of layering is more deliberate. And by deliberate, I mean, maybe it's time to actually create a new way to think about well-being indexes with Indigenous worldviews layered over top of all of this work that we've seen. Good foundational work. And if we really think about the principle, you hear sharing is a very common principle. Maybe the Indigenous approach to well-being is something that Canada would adopt. So we'd actually turn the tables around. Instead of us trying just to contribute, maybe we can actually provide some real thought leadership here. Maybe it will lead to some very interesting approaches that could benefit both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And this is really the story of New Zealand. I mean, in New Zealand, non-native folks learn Maori languages. They practice cultural traditions. They learn the hymns and the songs. So they've really embraced this idea of, it's not them and us, it's how to incorporate and live Maori ways of doing and thinking. And so to me, I think there's lots to be learned from that sort of integrated, aligned approach. So that's how I think of layering. And that's why we're interested in, if we're really going to advance Indigenous innovation to achieve better well-being, we should be able to answer the question, well, what's well-being? And this webinar, we're scratching the surface now. So stay along for the journey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would answer the question. I mean, it's an extraordinarily complex question because it's really getting at this whole sense of the different worldviews, right? And you know, we certainly know that in Indigenous communities and across the country, there's a diversity of worldviews depending on, you know, the traditional homelands and the land and so on. But I mean, fundamentally, there's a vastly different sort of relationship with the land, for instance, or with a sense of a multi-generation planning and many aspects of sort of the world outlook among Indigenous people. And what we're saying is that if you firstly get a better understanding of what that worldview is about, and start to apply it to sort of Western world organizations in the employment side of things, it would result in, you know, better nation-to-nation building with inside organizations and between non-Indigenous and Indigenous structures and institutions. But I just think a better sense of harmony would result from all this. And that's at the basis of what we're talking about with layering, is the ability to create a much more sort of compatible relationship than what we see today. So very, very complicated stuff, but yeah, great question, obviously.
Well, I'll just add one more thought. Where it plays out, folks, and where Curtis is taking us on this question is, where it plays out in real life is, you know, I'll use an example. I've been in a boardroom where an elder has stood up in a court, this is in a resource company in a corporate setting, and said, our community is all for development. Our community wants jobs. Our community wants to develop our economies. But I have a question, and this is the elder talking. I have a question. How are you going to take care of my brothers and sisters, the fish, the plants, the insects, the winged ones, the four-legged? And the room is silent. So that's well-being in practice, right? That's living it out in a boardroom. And the good thing about this resource company is they were willing to be vulnerable and open, and they had worked with these First Nations and Métis groups for a long time. So this wasn't a shocker. It was kind of an open, transparent discussion. And you saw executives actually saying, okay, how are we going to care for the water? And then the other aspect of this, in groups like BHP and others, when they've done some of their mining operations, the First Nations and the mining company have done, for example, a land ceremony before they open up the earth, or a water ceremony. So again, it's another aspect of well-being, is that you're so respectful that you actually incorporate ceremony into economic development. So this is sort of that's sort of how I see it playing out in life in real time. And there's either positive things or there's lots of friction, right? And hell, there's lots of friction. Just go to the courts and we know there's lots of friction. So again, I think, how can well-being create better social capital, better relations? That's the other aspect of all of this.
I saw Marika had her hand up and I don't see it now, but maybe she's still there.
And keep scanning because I can only see X amount on my screen. So Subhash, Rudy, and Paula, screen through and let us, yeah, that Marika,
Marika, there you are.
Hi, thank you. I'm actually just coming back to this question of layering and picking up on your comment about boardrooms. I'm so happy you brought up boardrooms because that's a perfect example where, assuming you have the infrastructure space, you can implement a change that begins to point to that inclusion, because I bet you that in that corporate boardroom, the table was oblong. I bet you it wasn't round.
Yes.
And First Nations, when we gather, we speak in circles. And it inherently lays a more equitable foundation for the discussion. All of a sudden, we're partners at the table. We are not reporting to some king who sits on high at the head. You know, there's a reason it was Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, because they were his peers. It was a council. It wasn't Arthur and the Knights of the corporate boardroom. So that's a simple infrastructure way that you can begin to flatten your organization so that people feel welcome, so that people feel like they can speak more frankly. You can look at each other in the eyes. And that's a simple thing that you can implement that begins to make the people in your space feel as though their voice is welcome and actually has a chance of being heard. And then from there, you can layer on more complex policies, more wide-reaching things, but there are infrastructure solutions.
Mhm.
I love it. Let's add Marika's to the bites and takeaways. Get out of the boardroom, go around a fire and sit in a circle. There's the next board meeting. Lila or Leela, not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Leela or Lila, please.
Hey, Layla, thank you so much for everything you shared today. I just maybe sort of on the heels of that, add to that last comment, and also because you were talking about sort of mining, and there's a photo here of some pipe being laid, and I'm saying this as a settler. I'm not an Indigenous person, but I know you can't address all of this in a 1 hour like webinar, but I'm just wondering about sort of systemic changes within organizations that would, like, I wonder about bringing in these values to organizations to increase like worker satisfaction or productivity, while an organization might still be doing work that contributes to colonial harm, for example, from like resource extraction, or say a banking company that still invests in resource extraction, which fundamentally disrupts the ability to have any wellness or any balance or sustainability, and creates ongoing colonial genocide and displacement, really. So I wonder about just bringing in the values to a colonial economic system, and how organizations could be also held accountable themselves for not contributing to the very sort of actions that might have disrupted these really core values of wellness and balance in a holistic sense. I'm not sure if you could speak to that a little bit. I'm just, like making the organization also divest from certain, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I do.
I would respond this way, is that you've touched on the very sensitive issues that people are now realizing, is that Indigenous people have diversity of thought, opinions, and ideas. There are people for and against pipelines. There are people for and against mining. There are people for and against different issues, and there are differences. So I think well-being, what I would say is that it provides, I would hope, a way for people to have those vigorous debates in a respectful way. It won't change people's views, but it might ground people so that we can continue to have these debates, deal with the friction, and find ways to help our communities move forward, and then to help our communities and companies move forward. So that's how I would look at it.
I was just going to comment as well that there's a professor out of the UK. I think his name is Banerjee, and a couple of summers ago he ran a big webinar with business schools globally who were talking about the theme of decolonization and indigenizing their curriculum and so on. And he got like 500 business school representatives from across the world, a big, big event. And at the very beginning, one of the professors rather thoughtfully, raised their hand and said, it's kind of poignant that that we're largely from the settler community, and we're being asked to sort of how to go about transforming our business schools and decolonizing them. And so it was really sort of questioning the validity of the exercise and the inquiry, and where does the push come from, and who gets to push in terms of how these new values, different values, are introduced to settler organizations. There's automatically a kind of hegemony built into that whole process, right? Because there just aren't enough Indigenous voices, and they don't necessarily have the power in the organization to make these changes. So it's a fascinating, this whole sort of concept of organizational transformation is quite fascinating.
We've, just to add to that, folks, I mentioned Luminary. So we now have the Business School Association of Canada. There are 64 business schools in Canada, settler ones. In addition, there are Indigenous controlled institutions. And so we're embarking upon pulling together the academic, Indigenous business, and NGOs so that we create this space. And we've actually co-created a plan already, a strategic plan for Luminary. Very, very exciting. And that's what I think really gets us excited about moving forward on innovation that can lead to well-being. And what does that well-being look like? So again, I think if you have any interest, let us know. We're going to be organizing sharing circles, and we're actually preparing funding proposals to move forward on this research agenda. So I want to be respectful of your time. We've come to the top of the hour. Great discussion, great chat comments. And like I said, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to next month, seeing you on the next Thought Leadership series for our members, and certainly for our non-members that want to join us as well. Great discussion. We are going to make this available. So again, you didn't have to take notes. You'll be able to see some of the references and some of the links that we provided in the deck. And so you'll be able to access that as members into our site. We are in the process, by the way, of updating our website and going from what's called Drupal 7 to Drupal 9, because Drupal 7 is out of date. And when we do that, we're going to have a members only portal. So we're going to watch for that. And that is going to be hopefully up and running within about 3 months. And it'll bring even more value add to our members. So thank you for joining us. Send us any comments or questions. Sandra, follow up from 10 years ago. Let's see, share that new knowledge with us, and enjoy the rest of the day, folks. Thank you very much. Make
That's great. Thank you as well. See you.